Joining us on Talking Sense today, Chief Rabbi, Dr. Warren Goldstein. Hello, Rabbi Goldstein. Great to have you on.
Yeah, Gabriel, thank you so much. So looking forward to our chat.
So, Chief Rabbi, before we get into the meat of the conversation, which will be about the kind of more political work you do, I think it's important to set out exactly who you are. And I think that in South Africa generally, there's not a great understanding about what religious leaders do generally, and then what Jewish religious leaders do even more specifically. And a great story that kind of illustrates this is, it might be an apocryphal one, but it's about Johan Leroux, who was a South African rugby player who bit a New Zealand rugby player, Sean Fitzpatrick, on the ear. And after that happened, he was apparently in an interview, and the interviewer said, "Do you know what rabies is and how to treat it?" And Johan then responds, "Yes, rabies is a Jewish dominee, and you treat it with a lot of respect."
Yeah, that's a great one.
And so, can you tell us, what is a rabbi, and how did you become one?
Yeah. So essentially, as he actually said it, it's a Jewish dominee. I think that's a good description. But really, the word rabbi means teacher. It refers to the responsibility to teach the divine wisdom that is contained in the Torah, in the Talmud, and all of our sacred books, and to guide people in accordance with those values. It's a position of religious leadership, social leadership. Each rabbi in their synagogue is involved then in leading their synagogue and helping to guide. Judaism is made up, both of its ideas and the philosophy, but also it's a very, very practical religion. And so often people require guidance in terms of applying Judaism to daily life. What does it mean? For example, to give charity. Yes. Jewish law, it actually leaves nothing to the imagination, in the sense that it defines it. So if it says you must be generous, so what does that mean? So Jewish law defines that means giving 10% of disposable income to charity. Yes. Less than that's regarded to be ungenerous. And then there are even laws of how to calculate that. How do you calculate disposable income? What does that mean? What are the kinds of causes you should give to? You have the Sabbath. How do you keep the Sabbath? It starts on Friday afternoon, finishes on Saturday night. What are the laws of the Sabbath? How do you keep a kosher home? How do you raise children? What are the right values? Well, there's so much guidance that is required to apply the divine wisdom of Judaism to daily life. That's one job of a rabbi. And then the other responsibilities of a rabbi in their synagogues is to look after people from a pastoral point of view, help people through moments of bereavement or illness, but also moments of joy. So it has all of that. And in South Africa, we have so many vibrant synagogues across the country, and each rabbi is responsible for their synagogue. The role as a chief rabbi then is to oversee all of the synagogues, the network of the synagogues and the rabbis and Jewish life more broadly, but obviously rooted in the values of Judaism.
And so how do you end up as the chief rabbi? Did you grow up in a particularly religious home, and did you feel like, was this always your calling, or how did it come about that you end up in this position?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's always so interesting. I also find it interesting to ask people about their lives and where they, how did it all happen? Mm-hmm. So I think in a sense, many South African Jews are traditional Jews. There's like a connection to the values of Judaism that we all grew up in. But actually, my path was not always going to be, to become a rabbi. In fact, part of my background, my father is a retired high court judge. Grew up from a legal, in a legal background. And I started studying, because part of what happens within Jewish communities, and this is throughout the world, there are academies which are set aside to advance yourself in terms of study of Talmud and Jewish philosophy. So I began studying at one of these places, and I really enjoyed it, and I wanted to continue that process. And we have an outstanding institution here in Johannesburg that allows for the training of rabbis and provides for that. I began that journey and always thinking, would this be something that I would take on professionally to do full time? And so when I completed actually the ordination, which takes it's a 7-year process of study a full-time study, studying Talmud and all the texts, because in order to be able to guide people in these values and how to live life and what does this divine system share with people, you need to be proficient in it. So it takes 7 years at least. And then, after I got that ordination, I'd already begun an online, today we'd call it online, but in those days, correspondence, through UNISA, did a BA. And after I got my ordination as a rabbi, I completed my LLB at UNISA, and then went on to do a PhD at WITS in human rights and constitutional law.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And because kind of what drew me to it was the fact that Judaism is really about the intersection between values and law and society. And there's so many powerful ideas that I discovered in my rabbinic studies.
Yes.
And so my thesis was really applying Jewish values through and looking at it from the perspective of Western law and South African law, and looking at the Roman Dutch tradition here, going all the way through our constitutional cases, looking at the constitutional cases in America and in Britain, looking at the United States Supreme Court decisions, our constitutional court decisions, looking at all of that through the lens of Judaism and saying, what would Judaism say about it? And, there were different topics there that I went into.
It's such a fascinating kind of journey, because it's almost as if you were studying kind of the two bookends of the kind of history of law, because on the one hand you have the rabbinic studies, which essentially takes you back a few thousand years and puts you at what is the beginning of the Western liberal tradition, because everything that we know in the West has to be spawned out of Judaism, even Christianity, and so these values, the original values, are then housed in that study, but then you take it all the way to the modern era and are studying kind of modern law. And so what did that teach you? That's just that intersection between kind of modern study of the law and then the study of the ancient laws of Judaism.
Yeah. So what I actually found in that, and this was something which emerged in the process of writing the thesis, was that Judaism has so much to teach modern Western society, South African society. And so I actually applied the principles of Judaism to current human rights issues. So I looked into issues like poverty alleviation, the exercise of political power, the rights of the accused versus society in the criminal justice system, and especially in the context of a crime wave, looking at women's rights and all of these things. And each time looking to bring the insights of Judaism to the most pressing issues facing society. And so in a certain sense, that is a framing, and it's part of my life mission is really to say, actually, the very issues that modern society is grappling with, Judaism has a solution and has solutions for that can change our way of thinking and actually help to make society a much better place.
So I think we're going to continue this conversation that you've just raised now, but a little bit later, because I do want us to have a conversation about how you see the kind of role of the divine in everyday life. But before we get to that, I think let's kind of change tack and look at your life just before and then immediately after October the 7th. Because, if I'm remembering correctly, just before October the 7th, you were Chief Rabbi. You were you were a religious leader. You were focused, as you said, on maintaining the networks of synagogues across the country, And then October the 7th happens, and it seems as though the South African state particularly is taken by a virulent form of antisemitism, and it seems to go on the attack against the Jewish community. And you respond by sticking your hand up and saying, I'm going to stand in the way between you guys and my community. And so why did you decide to take that decision in the first place? What was it that you thought, no, flip, I have to stop this. I have to be the one to get up and say no more.
Yeah, so I think here it goes to the heart of what leadership is about, and also from the perspective of Judaism, and that is leadership is about doing the right thing. It's about the morality of the situation. It's in a certain sense, and this goes to the heart of what Judaism is about and the tradition of it, is to say that it's more than just something for the synagogue and worship and in that strict narrow definition of religion. That's what my PhD was about, and that is so much, I believe, what Judaism is about. And that's why, although October 7, it came out in and expressed itself in the most dramatic form, since the beginning of my term of office. Before that, during the years of state capture under President Jacob Zuma, I joined the civil society protests against the then president and added my voice and spoke against what he was doing and what was happening in the country at the time as an expression not of politics but of morality. Yes. And being kind of that voice of morality within society. And so there was a precedent for that. Obviously, post October 7, it took on a completely different form in the sense of how strongly it was expressed. But that kind of mandate went back, and it's something that has touched on many different aspects of my work. But you are correct in saying October 7, everything changes at that point.
And so what strategy do you start to pursue after October 7th? Because you maybe tell us, what it was like when you, maybe the day after, probably hearing some of the reports of, for example, Naledi Pandor getting off the phone and Hamas putting out a statement that she reportedly congratulated them, and then Durko disavowing this, but not disavowing the fact that she was calling with the leader of Hamas the day after the biggest massacre of Jews since, the Holocaust. And so, what did you decide to do from that point onwards to say, I'm going to show these guys what's up?
Yeah, I think to me, and I can still remember it right now as we sit here, what was a pivotal moment was the Saturday night after October 7. So October 7 was on that Saturday. On the 14th of October, 1 week later, as you know, in terms of Judaism, we don't switch on phones. We don't use electronics on the Sabbath. Yes. So my phone had been off the whole of the Sabbath. And so it went off on Friday afternoon on the 13th of October, and I switched it on Saturday night, the 14th of October. And when I switched on my phone that Saturday night, I saw the social media imagery of President Cyril Ramaphosa together with all the members of the NEC, of the ANC, the National Executive Committee of the ANC, draped in kaffirs, declaring their allegiance and solidarity with Hamas. And that was deeply horrifying on so many different levels, because that was really, as you say, October 7 was the greatest, most horrific massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. And for them to then stand up and not say one word of condemnation about that, not one word, and for the president himself to be there and the full National Executive Committee all publicly doing that, together with what Naledi Pandor did, with Hamas, and then later on, just a few weeks later, visiting Tehran. And all of that brought out in the most dramatic fashion that here was a government that was declaring war against the Jewish community of South Africa, and truth be told, against all people of faith who understand, and people of decency who understand the horrors of October 7. When I say declaring war, it's political warfare, and saying we are setting about here to isolate the state of Israel, and by extension then all those who support the state of Israel. And so then that was an attempt at isolating the South African Jewish community and all those who support Israel in the most horrific way, and in the breach of the most basic morality. I mean, it was so obvious to any decent person in the world, no matter what political views that you had, that this was beyond the pale, and they couldn't even bring themselves to condemn it. Yes. It's astounding.
So what did you decide to do to start to put the pressure on them? You see this, I mean, it was some of the most horrifically disgusting behavior in the wake of, as we've talked about already, the most dreadful atrocity to occur to the Jews since the Holocaust, with babies murdered, women, I can't say it because we will be demonetized on YouTube if I do, but assaulted, hostages taken into the most atrocious conditions. and you're sitting there as one person and you're trying to do something about it, what is it that you decide to do from then on?
Well, firstly, I had to give a framing to my community, because there's a deep sense of betrayal that, when you're a citizen of a country and the government does something which you find so abhorrent, can you continue even living there? How do you even continue living? And there was a moment on that Sunday morning, on that Sunday, the 15th of October, where there was a community rally in support of Israel and kind of really to absorb the shock as a community of what had happened on October 7. And I was due to speak that morning, and I didn't know what to say. I must be 100% honest with you. I didn't know what to say, because what words can you really say under these conditions? And how is it going to give my community a framing for how to face this crisis? And then at that moment, just minutes before I went up, a woman came over to me, and that became the conversation I had with her, became the inspiration for the speech and gave me the insight that I needed. She came over to me to say, because on the stage there was the South African flag and the Israeli flag were on the stage. And she came over to me to say the South African flag should be taken down because look at the actions of the South African government. And I said to her, no, you can't do that. Instinctively, I straight away said, you can't do that. In a democracy, the government of the day are the servants of the people. They're employed for a brief period of time from one election to another. They don't own the country.
Yes.
They don't own the country, and they don't own the flag. And therefore, the flag belongs to the people of South Africa. The flag will remain up. The ANC does not own that flag, and they don't own the country. And that, with that moment and that conversation, I had the first of a number of key strategic insights, because I find in a moment of crisis, the most important thing that one needs as a leader is to get strategic clarity, real proper analysis that leads to strategic clarity. And I had it at that moment, and I spoke on that platform that day, and I said, the ANC does not own South Africa. We don't actually want your support. You support all of the worst actors in the world, the brutal regimes of Russia, China, and Iran, not to mention others. And I said, we don't want your support. We don't need your support, and you don't own this country. We are proud South African citizens. You don't own this country. You try to steal it. I said that at that speech, but you can't, because the people of South Africa stopped you from doing that. And that distinction between the government and the country became a critical one. And so that's why a week or two later, I changed the prayer. We pray in our synagogues by tradition for the government of the day. And I said, from now on, we're going to be praying for the people of South Africa, not the government of South Africa, to draw that distinction between the people and the government. And that was one crucial dimension of the framing of the struggle.
Yes.
There are others, but that was almost step one in the process.
Yes, okay. And so you've now kind of framed it. You've understood that you've got this difference between the government and the people, and you want to have the people on side, but you want to make sure that the government, you put the government back into its place. And so from an outsider looking in, I saw that you had this kind of started to develop this YouTube channel, started to go after specific issues in speeches. And so what was the kind of thinking behind these moves that you were taking? Were you trying to box the ANC in? What were you trying to do?
So the idea behind these speeches was then to make a very compelling argument and to go on the offensive against the ANC and the government, and to say that you don't cross this line. You're trying to isolate this community. You're trying to stigmatize us. You're trying to say we are genocide supporters. You're trying to say the only Jewish state in the world is perpetrating genocide, is guilty of apartheid and colonialism. You're wrong on all of those fronts. You're wrong on all of those fronts from a rational point of view, from a factual, historical point of view, from a legal point of view. And what I then began to do was to marshal the facts and to lay out the arguments, and also to lay it out from a moral perspective, talking as a religious leader, not just as a politician, to say, look, what is happening here is an injustice. And I then spoke not to the government, I spoke to the country. I went over their heads. People said to me, what did the president say? I'm not talking to him. talking to his bosses, the people of this country. And I spoke to the millions and millions of Christians, of liberal Democrats in this country who understand the ideas and what was at stake and the morality of what is at stake, and how Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East fighting for its life against a barbarous organization that is violent in the extreme, and that has an evil ideology that seeks the murder and the wiping out of anyone who disagrees with its version of religion and worship of God. And that what was really happening in Israel in that fight was part of a broader fight between the values of modern Western liberal democracy and the values of jihadism, which were being expressed. And I felt very strongly, and I made the arguments for this, that actually what South Africa needed to be doing, and what we do need to be doing as a country, is aligning this country and the people of this country with the forces of freedom, dignity, democracy, faith, decency. And that's where the ANC betrayed the people of South Africa. And so on the one hand, I was out there defending the Jewish community of South Africa, saying, we will not stand for this. We will not tolerate this. We will not accept this kind of behavior from this government. You work for us. You work for the people of this country. This is why you're wrong. And to make the argument from a rational perspective. Yes. So you can't just go and play the race card, you're anti-Semites. It's not about that. It's actually saying you're dead wrong on the facts, and those have consequences, and we're not going to tolerate that, and we're going to reach out to our fellow South Africans to help persuade and understand what is truly at stake here from a moral and a legal perspective. So it was really to go on the offensive and to say, we're not going to take this lying down, we're not going to be quiet, and we're actually going to form an opposition against you that is going to cause trouble for you with your own voters, going to the heart and soul of this country, where there are so many who, the vast majority of South Africans, which is one of the great things about this country, the vast majority of South Africans who have decent, good values, who have an understanding of what it means to believe in God, but also to respect the image of God in every human being, and understand what is at stake, and understand the struggle that Israel is going through, and the importance of the Israeli victory, and the importance of standing up to such barbarism.
Yeah, and also, it's a very interesting thing. I think it's a point that Douglas Murray has made a few times, and he makes it very well, that often the people who are, I think he's referencing someone whose name is slipping from my mind, but he said often the people who are accusing the Jews of something, what's happening there is that when you accuse the Jews, what you're really doing is you're showing what you are guilty of.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant point in the South African context, because actually the whole country knows, which is why, the ANC lost its majority in this last election. And according to opinion polls, I mean, your own opinion polls in the SRF, how, it's headed down to the 30s.
Yeah.
And to the low 30s, and maybe even, beyond that. So what the ANC did by aligning itself with Iran, Hamas, Hezbollah, this entire ring of terrorist organizations and murderous regimes, actually was a symptom of a deeper, and is a symptom of a deeper rot within the ANC. And so that started to come out, it's now starting to come out, and it's the things which I addressed, the connections between the ANC senior leadership, including the president, and MTN, and its relationship with the Iranian Republican Guard, and how that's now actually in a class action suit in New York City,
yes,
where family members of fallen U.S. Marines are suing MTN because they are accusing them of being complicit in switching off the cell phone networks to assist the Taliban in their war against the U.S. Marines, and U.S. Marines died. So what happened, and it's not just on the global front, the right, but the local front, the corruption, the lack of service delivery, the betrayal of the values of this country, on the inordinate murder rate, which is so horrifying, and that was amplified so much when President Ramaphosa was in President Trump's at the White House. All all of these things are symbolic of the deeper rot. And so the anti-Israel, anti-Western stance of the ANC betrays the South African people and the interests of this country.
Yes, for sure. And so you talked about going on the offensive and how that was the decision you take. We're going to take the fight to these guys. And I've got a kind of double question with regards to that. The first one is was that a successful strategy? And the second one being, what is your response to an argument that I think was quite common, especially in the beginning of when you started doing what you're doing within the Jewish community, which was essentially, listen, what you're doing is poking the bear here. This government already doesn't really like us that much, and we know that. And why the hell do you want to get them even more angry? Because they're already treating us badly. So keep your head down, shut up, and at least maybe they'll leave us alone. What do you say to that argument? Because I'm sure you faced it many times.
Yes, I did. Look, in terms of the response of this from the community, wherever I went, I found and felt tremendous support from so many people. There were people who raised this point that you raised, don't poke the bear. And my answer to that is, you don't become safe through weakness. You find peace and safety and security through strength.
Yes.
And you see, a response of saying, well, we're just going to hide and we're going to pretend this, didn't happen, and we're going to hope that you don't notice us. I think there are two problems with that. Number one, it is a betrayal of morality, because how can you be silent in the face of such injustice and something which is so horrific from a moral point of view? Silence is acquiescence. So number one, never mind any political benefit from it. You see, as a religious leader, I answer to God. So put aside the politics. Maybe it was good politics, maybe not. I think it was good politics, which I'll argue in a moment. But putting aside, even if it was bad politics, I would say it was the right thing to do, because how could I stand before God and say I was silent during this time when the South African government not only then initially, as it did, expressed its support for Hamas, sent its, Minister of International Relations to Tehran, but then launched the ICJ case against the State of Israel. And then to remain silent in the face of all of that, it would be betraying God himself. It's like saying, how can you? It's like remaining silent during the years of apartheid. How could anybody do that? You can't be silent in the face of injustice, because then you are part of it and you're supporting it.
Yeah.
But I think apart from being the right thing to do, I think the politics of it were dead right, because ultimately politics and society is about strength. It is about competing interests. And in a democracy, you have to stand up for yourself. You have to stand up for what you believe in. And what you see, this is not only in the political sphere, and if you look through the world history, we'll find this time and time again. That Neville Chamberlain thought that he wouldn't poke the bear of Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany, and that if he would just sort of give them what they want and try to avoid confrontation, then war would be averted. But it turns out now, and I've just been reading an interesting book called Coffee with Hitler about the part of the appeasement movement. It turns out now, and we now see it with absolute clarity, that had Britain been more forceful in dealing with Nazi Germany, World War II could have been averted. The war came because they were too soft and quiet.
Yes.
And here in the South African context, obviously very different from that set of circumstances, but the fundamental dynamic remains the same. If you want peace, if you want to have a security for the Jewish community, for any community in this country, you have to be able to challenge the government of the day.
Yes.
And they have respected that. They've respected the show of force and saying, listen, this so far and no further. We will not tolerate this. You will have an opposition. We will continue to oppose you. We're going to reach over your head to the voters of this country. And I think that worked, because at the end of the day, they've backed off. They've backed off. We, as a community, can hold our heads with great pride in this country because all of the worst allegations were thrown our way, and we stood up to it. We rejected those, said, listen, it is unacceptable. It is beyond the pale, and it's for these reasons with rational arguments. And that is actually how the dynamics works. Similarly, if you think about Israel now has greater levels of safety than it has had in recent times.
Yes.
With all of its worst enemies defeated, because ultimately there has to be a show of strength in order to achieve peace. And I think on the political front, it's exactly the same.
Yeah, well, I mean, and if you just to kind of extend this thinking back to the Israeli society, I think the post October 7th realities explain exactly what it is you're talking about here, where prior to October 7th, essentially it's felt like the Israelis accepted for maybe 14 plus years that we can live with the reality of Hamas throwing bombs at us every night and every day, and for them to keep firing, and we'll just keep shooting down the rockets because we don't really want to poke the bear, and and it feels kind of bad because everyone makes will go at us if we respond with force to the force that's being the rockets that are being thrown at us. And then you get to see what happens if you let something like that continue for over a decade, because eventually these guys will stop throwing rockets that'll get shot down, and they'll launch an attack on you. And then post the October 7th reality, it seems Israel has once again clocked a truth that I think it's known in the wake of every war that it's fought, that its survival can only be guaranteed by its strength, And I think that you are an example of that, the truth of that extended outside of the Israeli context, that actually if you want to achieve these things, if you want to keep the peace, you have to be strong enough to do that.
Yeah, and I think that is really part of what democracy is about.
Mm.
You see, in democracy, you have the full right and I would say responsibility as a citizen to stand up and say what you believe and to attempt to rally people around your vision and your values. And that's exactly what I did.
Yes.
And a democratically elected government understands that power, the power of reaching to the country. And so my messages were to the people of South Africa, and I received so much support. The amazing thing of YouTube as a platform, and this applies to all of the social media, don't have to go through the legacy elite media in order to reach the people. I went directly to the people.
Yes.
And on my YouTube channel since October 7, it has millions and millions of views.
Yeah.
Because it was resonating with people, both locally and globally. And locally, I was talking to the values of South Africa and saying, actually, what this government is doing is not just a betrayal of this Jewish community, which in and of itself would be a terrible injustice, because this Jewish community, the Jewish community of South Africa, has contributed to this country and the development of this country in business and medicine and law and in every field of human endeavor, and in welfare and poverty alleviation. So it betrayed all of that, but also I would say betrayed South Africa. This is a betrayal of South Africa, and that was also the thinking behind these speeches, is to say that don't seek to isolate the Jewish community away from the rest of South African society and stigmatize us. We won't accept that. And number two is, actually, most South Africans stand with us. And actually our values, which I felt on many occasions. I mean, I addressed FNB Stadium just under a year ago, around about then, and spoke to a packed stadium, of ZCC members, and I could just feel the warmth, the support, and I spoke about these values and the importance of morality and God and faith and Israel and Jerusalem, and this is a country of faith. This is a society that cherishes freedom and faith and meaning and purpose and the divine values of the Bible.
Yeah.
And so that to me gave me a lot of encouragement in this. But the worst thing one can do in a situation like this is to back off out of fear. Fear brings more danger.
Yes, and on that quick question about your experience at the F&B Stadium, it was like meant to be an interfaith gathering, correct?
It was a day of prayer.
Day of prayer, okay. And you, if I remember correctly, one of the things that got the warmest cheer was you said something about President Ramaphosa or something like that, and then people burst out.
Well, I was saying, in that speech, I was saying that I said to the people in the stadium, you represent the finest part of this country as people of faith and decency and morality, and we need your faith and decency and morality and purity. We need that in the union buildings and in Parliament. And your voices need to be heard in the union buildings and in Parliament, the voice of all South Africans. And there was, roars of approval for that, because this is the heartland of our values in this country. And so I think what emerged in the struggle is actually a defining moment of who are we as South Africans? What is South African society truly about? And the values that I spoke for in this time were resonating with that.
And on that point you make about the values of South Africa, one of the kind of views that seemed to develop apparently at the time was amongst the Israeli Foreign Office was, when all of this was happening, you remember that there were those big diplomatic spats between Israel and South Africa. It seemed as though some of the Israeli Foreign Office were hoping to themselves, gosh, well, maybe let's just abandon this country. And if by doing that, we let the Jews see how horrible it is to live here, and maybe then they'll all kind of pack up their things and move to Israel, and we don't even have to think of and deal with these flippant South Africans anymore. But your argument was essentially, no, I am a South African, as well as being a religious leader and a Jew. I am a Jewish South African, and I am here, and I'm going to fight for my place in this country, right?
Yeah. Well, what I feel very strongly about is this: that you can't back off in the face of evil and wrongdoing and hide like a coward. So I say this, part of our faith is a very deep connection to the land of Israel and everything that it stands for. It's part of Judaism. It's in the Hebrew Bible. That's why this allegation that somehow Jews are colonialists in the land of Israel, which we have a connection which is more ancient to the land of Israel than any nation on earth has to its land. I mean, Jerusalem was the capital of Israel long before London or New York or Paris or any of these famous capitals were even in existence or even dreamed of. Yeah. So we have this deep, long connection and religious connection through the Bible, through God to the land of Israel, and that is bound up with Jewish identity. I think here what was a critical point was this: you don't run away in the face of battle. If forces of wrongdoing and darkness come and say that the barbarism of October 7, that is somehow part of some kind of justifiable armed struggle, that is so evil, it's so abhorrent, you can't run away from that. You have to stand your ground. It's you have to stand and fight for goodness, for decency. We're not running away as cowards. And I would say the same, is to many people in New York today who are so rattled by Mamdani, and I know Jewish community in New York. I would say, don't be intimidated. He is a servant. He's a servant of the people of New York. His time will come and it will go. Yeah. President Ramaphosa and his ANC government are servants of this people. They were elected for a limited period of time. They're answerable to the people of South Africa. In a democracy, in the same way the ANC doesn't own South Africa, Mamdani does not own the city of New York. Yeah. Belongs to the people of New York, and you fight back. and hold your values. And when he accuses Israel of genocide, you say that is beyond the pale, and these are the reasons why you are so wrong, and that is a perversion of morality, and we will not accept it, and we will not stand for it. And it's not only that, it is part of a deeper expression of his anti-Western values. It's the values of the founding fathers of the United States of America. You don't back off in the face of people who come to intimidate you, and people who come with values which seek to undermine everything which is sacred in your society.
Yeah.
You don't back off. You stand tall, you stand proud, and you stand firm.
Exactly. I couldn't agree with you more on that point. And so I want to sorry. I have a last question on the kind of fight in South Africa, and then we'll kind of broaden our conversation to a few other topics before we wrap. And the last question I have on South Africa is, during this journey, did you ever feel threatened, or were you ever intimidated?
This is a free country. This is a free country. And I assert that and stand firm on that. And so, we've got to understand this, and it's a part of a broader discussion. There is a threat of violent jihadi terror, which is directed across the continent, and certainly here is a threat to the Jewish community of South Africa and of many other faith communities in South Africa as well. At the forefront of that threat is Iran itself, which has embarked upon a policy over the last number of years to target Jewish communities where they are. In fact, the Australian government, just in the last few months, expelled the diplomatic mission of Iran because it found that it was linked to the terror attack on the Melbourne synagogue just over a year ago. And so it's happening all over the world. And so that remains a threat. That has been a threat facing our Jewish community. We have, as a community, put a lot into security to be able to protect our synagogues and schools, and that is a very important. But it's not only a threat to our community. It is a threat to other faith communities in South Africa. And in fact, this threat of jihadi terror is something which is engulfing the African continent, which is something that has to be raised. And is a topic that I've spoken about on numerous occasions. I spoke about it when I was in Washington at the APAC conference, and spoken about it since. And that is the Christian communities of Africa. And Africa is home to the largest Christian community in the world, of 600 million Christians on the African continent. And there is a jihadi war against the Christians of this continent, carnage that is happening everywhere from Nigeria to Sudan to Mali to Mozambique, right across the continent, a continental war, and the world has to take note.
Well, it's so interesting though that you are talking about Christians of Africa, one of the Jewish leaders of South Africa, and one of the things that's quite disheartening is, we at the Common Sense, we follow some of the kind of terrorism as a news organization. I've seen the jihadism you're talking about, but why is it that you, as the Jewish leader, seem to be one of the few voices who are able to and willing to talk on this? Why is there not outrage across every Christian community in this country and across every Christian community in the world about what is happening to their fellow religious brethren who are being, beheaded, having their churches burnt? They are being subject to a systematic terror campaign by a number of different jihadi groups, and yet no word from their leaders.
Yeah, it's a very important question, and it's pointed, and they have to answer. They're going to have to answer before God and before their conscience about why the silence. Why the silence? And how can it be? It's the most basic of biblical values. That point where God confronts Cain after he kills his brother Abel, and he says to him, "What have you done?" And he says, "Am I my brother's keeper?" Those are the famous words he says to defend himself against it. And then God says to him, what have you done? The blood of your brother calls out to me from the ground. And I say this to all of my fellow religious leaders, the blood of our brothers call out to us from the ground. And it's not only religious leaders, but let's ask about the political leadership. This government that holds itself to be one of the leading governments on the African continent, where are they? Where are their voices? Where's the action? I mean, there is the G20 is going to be hosted here now. How is this not on the agenda? The persecution of Christians on the African continent should be and must be the lead item on the agenda. This is a G20 being held in Africa, hosted by an African country, and the single biggest issue there is a war on in Africa. How can this not be on the agenda? I mean, President Ramaphosa must answer that question. President Ramaphosa, why, you the chairman of the G20, why is the African genocide being perpetrated against African Christians, why is it not on the agenda? Why is it left to President Trump to threaten Nigeria, to say that if you don't protect your Christians, we're going to send in troops? Why is it left to governments outside of Africa to come forward to defend? Yeah. And I think every member of the G20 has to ask themselves this question. And I'm making the call in this discussion that we're having. I want to make the call that the persecution of Christians in Africa must be on the agenda of the G20. If it's not on the agenda of the G20, it shows a total lack of integrity of the entire institution and this gathering. Mm-hmm. How can it be? And I had a delegation of religious leaders from different parts of the world who came to see me in my office a number of months ago in preparation as religious leaders preparing for the G20. Mm-hmm. So I said to them, come, let's put on this agenda the persecution of Christians on the African continent. No one agreed to that. I said, well, if you're not going to put on the agenda, then we're all wasting our time. Yeah. This is the single biggest issue affecting faith communities across the African continent. Yeah. Where is it? And part of the reluctance in doing it is because, you see, it touches on it touches on understanding the narrative of what is happening in the world today. Because just across the northern border here in Mozambique, ISIS Mozambique is going village to village, murdering Christians, kidnappings, beheadings. Nigeria, kidnappings, beheadings, right across the continent. The country of Mali is about to fall to Al-Qaeda. It could be the first country on the continent and in the world at the moment to come under a caliphate of Al-Qaeda. Yeah. And where's the world? There is a crisis. This continent is burning. And where's the world?
Yeah, well, exactly. And I think it's so interesting that you talked about your experience with some of the other religious leaders and what you found when trying to raise this issue with them, that it is so it is mind-blowing that it is so difficult to get anyone to care about something so obviously wrong. And it must be the case that there has to be something going on that is kind of happening that is shielding this from the view of people. Do you think that there is something kind of a little bit nefarious? Or
well, I think there's also sometimes people find it difficult to deal with things which are really dark and unpleasant and uncomfortable, and rather pretend it's not there. But there's something deeper beyond that kind of natural human psychology. Yes. And it's not just an African problem. There is a multi-continental war, which is a world war, which is happening. You see, Israel is facing Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran. But really the values of Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran are the same values as Al-Shabaab on this continent, as ISIS, as Boko Haram. It's the same values that we're here to murder the infidel. Yes. And so, that infidel can be the Jewish infidel in Israel or the Christian infidel in Africa. I mean, what Palestinian state is ISIS Mozambique fighting for? I mean, and therefore it betrays actually what is going on. Yeah. It shows and reveals the war that is happening, and it's important for good people to come forward, because how can the world be left to this kind of extremist barbarism? And it's a multi-front struggle.
Well, it's absurd that, you can have a conversation with people, a serious conversation with people who tell you that they want reparations for slavery, of Western slavery that was ended, latest in America in the mid 1800s. But when you want to talk to them about the fact that there are more slaves living today, primarily because of organizations like Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, who you love the practice of slavery, in fact, and celebrate the practice of slavery and see it actually as a moral good to enslave infidels, that they will stay completely stum about, what the evil that's going on there, but talk about the evil of slavery in America in the mid 1800s, and now modern America has to pay for those mistakes. I mean, the moral hypocrisy that's going on on this specific issue it's eye-watering almost.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think what it brings home is the importance of removing the emperor's clothes. And really, I would say, yeah, with the G20 coming now, it's an important time to remove the emperor's clothes on this G20, on the so-called African leadership of the G20, and to say this: if this issue is not dealt with, well, then this organization stands exposed.
And so I want to turn for our last two topics to Israel, and then to kind of the lessons of faith that you can impart on when explaining what's happened in Israel, and then kind of faith in everyday life. But before we get to faith in everyday life, it looks like Israel is in a fantastic position today. They've smashed Hamas, they've defanged Iran, Hezbollah has gone the way of the pager, Qatar has seemed to back off its support of Hamas a little bit. The Houthis are a shell of what they were. And so a country that used to be surrounded by bloodthirsty enemies who viewed their ultimate annihilation as the kind of principal goal, those enemies are now no longer much of a kind of threat anymore. I mean, the threat still exists, but to a degree that's so much less than it was. It's almost amazing. Did you ever imagine that something like this might happen with Israel?
Well, I think what emerged in this war is two things. One is the resilience and the strength of the Israeli people. They were tested in the most brutal way. And remember that Israel has a civilian army. So that means that it is made up of reservists who had to leave their jobs and their families and who have fought for these 2 years. And it's a small country with a small population. And so any bereavement is felt and reverberates throughout the country. So many soldiers' lives lost, the wounded, the hostages, the psychological trauma, and yet Israel stood firm. So there is a tremendous story of resilience, and that story of resilience goes back to 1948, the establishment of the State of Israel, when there were only 600,000 Jews in the state. And as when the state was declared based on that United Nations resolution, it was invaded by 5 Arab armies on all sides, and many of the people inside were Holocaust survivors themselves, and so it showed tremendous resilience. The other thing that has become clear over and since 1948 until now is the story of divine miracles. I mean, there is actually no other way to explain it. You can actually feel the sense of the miraculous in everything that has happened, from the fact that 1945 our Jews were wiped out. We lost 6 million brothers and sisters in the gas chambers and the crematoria of Nazi Germany. And then for a people to lose the third of the total population, and then to see the reestablishment of a Jewish state after almost 2,000 years of exile, that was miraculous, and throughout the years. But this war now, I've seen the most remarkable miracles that this tiny country, with all of the odds stacked against it, with all of these murderous enemies who have no compunction about how they perpetrate barbarism, and yet Israel holds itself to the highest standards. It is the IDF is the most moral army in the history of recorded human warfare. So they had to hold these higher standards of ethics while fighting a murderous, barbaric enemy on multiple fronts, and with the incredible pressure imposed on it by the global community, the United Nations, the EU, surrounded on all sides in the diplomatic war. And to be able to achieve these kind of military victories, to humble Iran, remove the nuclear threat from Iran, to completely disable Hezbollah, in dazzling successes. You can really feel the miracles in it. There's something that is happening here and that has happened which defies the normal laws of history. It just defies it. There isn't historical precedent for what we have seen over these years, but it's come with so much pain and suffering and noble heroism. But yet, just to take a step back and to thank God for the incredible miracles, and to see the forces of good overcoming the barbarism.
So you would say that many analysts would say that it's the strategies, the battlefield tactics, maybe the modern weaponry, but you would go a step further as to why Israel was successful here was because of divine intervention, essentially.
Yeah, look, certainly, and the truth is, faith is about seeing God's hand in everything. It's about seeing God's hand in these open miracles like we've seen over these 2 years. It's about seeing God's hand and presence in life, in the birth of a child, in the magnificence of what is nature, of the brilliance of the human mind, of daily life itself is filled with God's presence, and certainly in history. And actually, what the history of the Jewish people shows is you can feel God's presence through history when you think about the odds against this tiny people having made it through thousands of years with the most formidable enemies, the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire, the Babylonian Empire, the Turks, Napoleon, the Nazis, the Soviets. We've seen them all come and go. They've all come to wipe us out, but we still left standing.
Yes.
And that somehow, firstly, it's a lesson to those as who have stood up against us and continue to do so. We're going to outlast you. We have always, and we've always done so by being on the side of right and committed to God and to who we are. But the story of Jewish history is a story of miracles and wonder.
Yeah. And so, stepping away from the conversation about the kind of divine presence in the story of Israel. And more towards the kind of, I think, lack of divinity or lack of appreciation of the divine in everyday life, particularly in the Western world. So, you see it all the time where new atheism kind of became the fad a number of years ago, and that's essentially in a lot of the Western world, it made being religious or religiosity a kind of it made it, people said it was quaint or outdated, old-fashioned, and the West, this modern West, sees itself as a kind of pillar of modernity, and so many people have moved away from the kind of embrace of the divine in everyday life. And so what would you say people are missing out on without having, God, not necessarily the Jewish God, because as I understand it, it's quite difficult for a non-Jew to become a Jew. It takes a lot more effort than, say, becoming a Christian, which is, you say a couple of words, you start going to church, and everyone's like, you're our guy now. But what are we missing without God in our lives generally?
Yeah. So just to on your last point there, what is unique about Judaism is that it does not seek to proselytize, and it really, the philosophy of Judaism is that there are certain foundational principles of morality that every human being should subscribe to, and once there is adherence to those basic principles, then the way that is expressed is by personal choice, and different religions and faiths can express it how they wish. The fundamental principles are belief in one almighty God who's the source of everything in the universe. And then there are basic principles of morality, such as sanctity of life, the dignity of the human being, the sanctity of property, the rule of law, the sanctity of marriage, the importance of children, and then at the heart of it all, the fact that the human being is created in God's image, which means that there is a soul, a non-material part of the human being, that we're not just physical creatures made up of an accumulation of atoms and molecules, that there is a soul that is at the heart of the human being, and that soul has an element of the divine. It's godly in its power, and that human creativity and genius and invention and innovation all comes from this Spirit of God within, and that the root of all human rights come from that, emerge from that. That, as the Talmud says, beloved is the human being created in God's image. And that idea actually formed the very foundation of the founding vision of the United States Constitution, which then influenced the entire Western civilization. The idea that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that
all men are created equal.
Yes, and endowed by their Creator, you see, with inalienable rights. The Creator gives the inalienable rights, not man, not government, not legislation. Human rights come from that. Yeah. And it comes from the divine within the human being. And that is what is being lost in large parts of Western society today, because the atheism which crept in from Charles Darwin onwards took out God, and when they removed God, they removed the Spirit of God in every human being. And when you lose that, then the human being becomes no different qualitatively from an animal. And the idea of the sovereignty and the greatness of the human being created in God's image is lost from the world. And then human beings become an expression of groups and tribes, and like animals hunting in packs, and it's survival of the fittest. Whereas when one believes in God, then you believe in the sovereignty of the individual. And belief in God is not like a blind faith. It is part of understanding that how does the magnificence of this world come about without a creator? There's a wonderful new book out. It's relatively new, by a professor, Stephen Mayer. It's called The Return of the God Hypothesis, and he's talking about how this idea of God as the creator is coming back into the world. And there are many different expressions of it, but what scientists have discovered is that the human cell with DNA and the programming, the coding that goes into the human soul, which is non-physical, is more complex than even the most complex computer coding that is available in the world today. Each and every single cell of the human being. So that is non-material intelligence, which is the organizing force in the human being and in life itself. So where does intelligent coding into creation come from if this world is purely physical and material? But what the world has lost then is that belief in God, and with that the belief in the human being as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many angles that, as someone who is a young person in this modern world trying to make sense of it, there's so many questions that come to my head. But one of the first things that came to me was, as you were talking, it's the old Nietzsche quote you mentioned, the kind of atheism that starts to creep in when Charles Darwin's around. That there's that Nietzsche quote that's always misquoted: God is dead and we have killed him. That they kind of leave it off there, but the full quote is: God is dead and we have killed him, and we will never be able to wash the blood off our hands. And I think that you are pointing to something like you and Nietzsche connect. The point you make and that point Nietzsche makes are connected, in that without the view that every individual has a piece of the divine inside of them, which endows them with, their own bit of divinity. And so you need to respect every individual because we are all an aspect of the divine. You can find yourself pretty quickly moving towards a view of the world that sanctions incredible violence. It's the view of the world that produced both Nazism and communism on both sides. It's the view of the world that saw, Adolf Hitler deem anyone who wasn't an Aryan German as somehow inferior to the Aryan Germans and worthy of extermination, or Stalin to see anyone who's not a proletariat as part of the bourgeois and the bourgeois as worthy of extermination. The same view of the world that you can define it by groups and not by the individual divinity is what leads to that kind of violence. And so I'm in complete agreement with you there that without this kind of an understanding of why we have these rights, and really at the basis is the kind of to use Jordan Peterson language, Judeo-Christian belief in the kind of spark of divinity in every human being, you actually aren't going to understand why it is fundamental we keep that, and why that is the kind of primary, it is the thing that allows us to have every other right, is this view of the world.
Yes, well, and the founding fathers of the United States understood that. They believed in the book of Genesis. The book of Genesis said God created man in his image. Mm-hmm. That's what it means after the flood and the unraveling of society. Then the foundation principle was, don't harm another human being because you're created in my image. And an assault on another human being is an assault on God. It also touches on this, that the loss for many people in modern society then of meaning and purpose. Because you see, Viktor Frankl, himself a Holocaust survivor, realized in the concentration camps that actually, and this has now been supported and upheld by many within the field of psychology, the deepest human need is the need for meaning and purpose. And that does not add up if you say the human being is a mere random accumulation of molecules, because purpose means, and meaning and purpose means that there was design. Yeah. Random, by definition, is there's no design. You can't have something which occurs as a result of a random accident can have no purpose and meaning. And human beings instinctively know that our lives have meaning and purpose. So if you take God out and you take the human soul out of it, then actually life has no meaning and purpose. And we know that's false intuitively in the most fundamental sense. And that how could it be that there's no God and there's no soul, and yet the defining, driving force in the human being is the search for meaning and purpose. And so, so many in modern society have lost that, the richness, the sense of drive and the sense of meaning and purpose that comes from faith, and of living a life which is dedicated to goodness, to morality, to understanding of how to defend the human spirit, the godly spirit within the human being. So much of that's been lost, and the world's been impoverished. But I am seeing a return. I am seeing a return. I see it in the Jewish community here. I see it in the broader South African society, in Western society. There's a new generation which is emerging that is not accepting the atheism of previous generations, and saying, listen, we look, our community has always been traditional. So in that sense, it doesn't apply so much to the South African Jewish community, but in Western societies, there's definitely a return. But one other point linked to this is, you see, jihadism believes in God, but they don't believe in the spirit of God or the divine image in every human being. So they're at war with the foundation principle of Western civilization, which is the human being created in God's image, the sovereign individual that has to be protected. Yeah. And the woke left in American society and in broader is at war with the same principle. It's just that it's a war that comes from atheism. That's actually why their alliance makes perfect sense, because they're at war with the same idea that the human being is created in God's image. Or as Martin Luther King put it, that his dream is that one day we'll be judged by the substance of your character, not by the color of your skin.
Yeah.
That goes against everything of Black Lives Matter and the movement of the woke left that sees human beings as groups and not as individuals.
Yes.
You see, he understood, because he was a man of faith. He believed in the book of Genesis. He understood the sovereignty of the human being created in God's image. And that's where non-racialism truly comes from. When you come with critical race theory and you see groups and its oppressor and victim, then, Hendrik Verwoerd would be very proud of the CRT movement today, because they're defining everything in terms of groups. You don't look at people as individuals. And so that is what has been lost in the world today. And so what is so needed, what is happening in Israel, in Africa, in America, is all part of a broader struggle about the values and ideas. And that's why over these last 2 years, I have felt so passionate that it is so important to articulate the values and the ideas that underpin the politics. This is not about politics. This is about values and ideas. Politics is the instrument that plays out those values and ideas in the arena of life and in society.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's so many threads that I wanted to pull at there, but I'm really running us quite over time, so I'm gonna try keep it as brief as possible. But the point that you ended on there, that values are kind of the substructure from which politics comes out of. Politics is the expression of that substructure. I think that's so fundamental, because in South Africa, I think because our democracy came so much later, and we didn't have to go through this period as a country like they did in the United States, of kind of trying to figure out, what does it mean to be a democracy, and what does being a democracy means? Well, we've got to have fundamental fights about these fundamental values. So fights about, the nature of the person. Are they entirely perfectible, or are human beings flawed? And so we cannot actually achieve a utopia because of the inherent flaws within human nature. And so the best we can do is the best we can do to create utopia, or to have a government that tries to minimize the flaws and maximize the good in human beings. And depending on that value, you have one system or another. And there's a number of different questions that need to be answered. And essentially all of those questions turn to the theological, because you cannot actually answer, what is the meaning of life has a political implication.
Yes.
But it is not a political question. It's actually a theological question.
Yeah, which comes full circle to the question that we kind of began our discussion, sort of what was I doing as a religious leader wading into this? And the answer now becomes so clear from, this discussion. It's really about the values and the ideas and the principles which are at stake, and the fight for justice, for human dignity, for freedom, for truth in the world. If that is not the responsibility and the calling of a religious leader, then what is?
Exactly. And the last kind of point that I want to talk to you about, just to kind of hear your perspective, given that, I'm finding everything you're saying here so compelling, is there's this idea that Carl Jung has, which I think is one of the great responses to atheism, which is essentially, he says, well, maybe the role of evolution, as we understand it as modern human beings, was to inevitably create a being that was capable of realizing that there was divine intervention at work. The reason why it takes a few billion years for the human being to become, through this process of random evolution, is that eventually what is created is a being that is capable, is self-aware, and through that self-awareness is capable of appreciating and understanding that there is actually a divine being that underwrites everything. And it's very difficult to kind of explain why it is human beings are self-aware by going through this kind of, argument that it's essentially random, and that, it's evolutionarily beneficial, because no other species is self-aware, and they all prosper, and you have tens of billions of insects that are, we say were evolutionary, incredibly successful. They don't need self-awareness for that. And so it doesn't actually have that much benefit to you, as an evolutionary creature, unless there is maybe a reason behind why you. Apologies to the viewer, you might be hearing a bit of Johannesburg in the background at the moment. But it's essentially that you need that was God created the self-awareness inside of us so that we might know that he exists and appreciate his existence, and thereby appreciate our own existence.
Yeah, look, it's interesting points you raise. I would say this. I mean, evolution these days is presented as if it's scientific fact, and the idea that things can come about through a random accident of this level of complexity is something which defies rationality in many ways, and we don't have time to go into it now, and it needs its own full discussion. But I think that the way that evolution is taught in the schools at the moment is problematic, because it's taught as if it's fact. And the bottom line is that it comes with a morality. It's not just a matter of discussing science. And there's a lot, as I said, this book, The Return of the God Hypothesis, and many other scientists today are really challenging its very foundations. Well, the divine spirit and human creativity, you can see qualitatively human beings are different from any other species on this planet. Look at the creativity, look at the excellence, look at the architecture, the medicine, the music, the human development in every field of human endeavor. It's you can see the spirit of divine creativity within the human being. It's just not an animal. It just is. It's blatantly clear. And I think that it's important now in modern society. We don't have time to delve into evolution right now, but we have to start speaking about God and faith to our children in schools, in universities, and to show that actually belief in God and belief in the divine spirit within every human being and the human soul, this is not a matter of fanciful beliefs. This is rational, it's fact, it's truth. And not only that, these are truths that the world needs right now, because from these truths emerge the idea of human equality and dignity. The Talmud says that when God created humanity, he created us from one man and one woman, Adam and Eve, in order to eradicate racism, because that means that we're all brothers and sisters. If we all come from the same father and mother, we're all brothers and sisters. But if you believe in random evolution, then you have to concede the fact that there could be intrinsic differences between the races. The idea of the brotherhood and sisterhood of all humankind is rooted in the book of Genesis. The idea of human rights, the idea of human development, the greatness of the human spirit is rooted in the book of Genesis, in belief in God and in the human spirit within. We have to talk to our children. We have to speak in universities. We have to start defending these ideas from a rational scientific point of view, and then explain the moral, psychological implications and why society needs faith in God now and faith in the divinity within the human being created in God's image more than ever, in order to thrive and to survive and to achieve the greatness that human civilization is capable of.
I think that's a fantastic place to end it. I've been Gabriel Makin, and this has been Talking Sense.